I've been shooting at 28 and 35mm for the majority of the past 12 months, respectively using my Ricoh GR3 and the prime lens on my Sony a7 IV, and the few times I picked up my 85mm, I felt like it was just a little bit too tight. 28 and 35 are definitely my most used focal lengths over the last year or so. I also play with my 50mm from time to time, and I have felt like the jump between each of these lengths are making a lot of sense. We often hear that 28, 35, 50 and 85 are the standard set of focal lengths to cover everything, but I feel like the jump between the 50 and 85 is a bit too big, and if we actually do the math, we can observe that it is indeed the biggest jump there is between all these focal lengths. I'll talk in viewing angle, and just making sure that you understand, the viewing angle refers to the extent of the scene that a lens can capture, and it is expressed in degree. I compared all diagonal viewing angles using a tool I found online. I'll link it in the description if you want to try for yourself. Then I calculated how much viewing angle we are losing in percentages when switching from one lens to another. When jumping from 28 to 35, we are losing 15.9% of viewing angle. From 35 to 50, we are losing 26.2%. And finally, there's a reduction of 38.8% of viewing angle when jumping from 50 to 85. Now that I made this calculation, it all makes sense why I feel like the jump between 50 to 85 is a bit too big and a bit more difficult to handle compared to the other. I recently got the opportunity to try a 50mm lens on my Fujifilm X-E4. It is an APS-C camera, which means that this lens was a 75mm equivalent in full frame terms, and I think it's a perfect sweet spot and a more logical focal length for something a bit tighter than 50mm. I did the calculation again, and we are losing only 31.2% of viewing angle from 50 to 70mm, which is closer to what we have when switching from 28 to 35 and from 35 to 50. So all that to say that 75mm felt just right in my hands, and maybe a better alternative for a long focal length prime. As you can imagine, I was quite busy over the last days of the year, celebrating Christmas and New Year, so I didn't shoot as much as I would have liked with this lens, but I still got a decent amount of photos I'm happy about that are showing all throughout the video. One of my goals last year, but even more moving forward, is to use depth of field more intentionally. This lens opens up to 1.8, and given that it is a quite long focal length, you can really isolate your subject and have a very creamy bokeh if you want. I still got a few shots with a shallow depth of field to test out the capabilities of this lens, and there's nothing wrong with shooting street portraits at f1.8, for example. I'm just trying to use that tool a bit more intentionally when the situation and a very strong subject really calls for it. Otherwise, I'm using tighter apertures, f4, f5 and above, to have a bit more in focus, more layers and more context in my photos. Using wider angle lenses where you only have a limited amount of bokeh and closing down your aperture when using a long focal length are two very crucial exercises you can do to make a lot of progress in photography, especially in the way you compose your images. The skill to find a composition and being able to adjust it correctly is one of the most important skills you can have as a photographer. Being lucky with the weather or lucky with the subjects you encounter when walking with your camera is not something you are in control of, but your ability to analyze a scene and getting the most out of it is something you can control and get more skilled at when practicing with a deeper depth of field. now I'll just talk briefly about the lens. It is the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 for the Fuji X mount, and it was sent to me by Yongnuo, so I didn't have to pay for it. They have no words to say on the video I'm making, in my opinion. It's not a review video, so in just a few words I think it's a decent lens for the price. You can get it for $118 on their website, so it is pretty much unbeatable for a 50mm autofocus lens opening at f1.8. The one from Fuji, the 50mm f2, is $449, so more than 3 times the price, but obviously it is better. I didn't try it personally, but I have the 35mm f2 and I believe they are very comparable in terms of image quality and autofocus capabilities. This Yongnuo lens is not that bad at all on this side, and I must say I didn't feel too much frustration in terms of focusing speed or focusing accuracy. The obvious downside though is the very noticeable chromatic aberration when shooting contrasty scenes at wider aperture. Other than that, it feels very light, which is very important in my opinion when it comes to doing street photography, and it feels like a well-built yet cheap prime lens. I think it's interesting that Fuji is making a 50mm lens on their f2 range of prime lenses. The other more premium range of faster lenses are made to match the standard full-frame equivalent. There is a 23mm that makes a 35, the 33 for 50, and finally the 56 that makes an 85mm equivalent. Like I said before, I prefer now the 75 over the 85mm, and I think it's nice that Yongnuo made a cheap alternative to the 50 and at the 56mm from Fuji. Last point I wanted to address is whether I will keep this lens and keep shooting with it, and I don't have to send it back, so I will keep it for now, but if I think about my whole setup, I'm quite unlikely to use it. With YouTube and how comfortable I feel using my Sony a7 IV for photos and videos, I rather see myself using my 50mm prime with the Sony and occasionally punch in with the super 35mm crop mode. That would give me the same 75mm focal length, and with the 33 megapixel sensor of the a7 IV, even in crop mode you have totally usable images. It was nice though to experiment with a 75mm equivalent prime lens to open my eyes and put the finger on why I feel like the gap between 50 and 85 is quite difficult to handle. That's gonna conclude today's video, and I hope you're enjoying your photography sessions, and let's catch up in the next one. Bye.